Howdy folks, welcome back to the Steampunk Desperado channel. This week I'm going to do something a little bit different, but don't worry, it is appropriate, especially to the season. Also, it works out for this channel because this is about a real-life historical character who was born in the Victorian era and who was rather a fixture in the world of the early 20th century. He's one of those larger-than-life personalities who became an archetype in fiction and in popular music and so forth, kind of like a meme of the era. And yes, he has appeared in steampunk. And it just so happens he was born exactly 150 years ago this month. I'm talking, of course, about the notorious, the wild, the wicked Aleister Crowley. With the sad passing of Ozzy Osbourne, I was listening to Ozzy's music, and of course, one of the songs I heard was Mr. Crowley, which was always one of my favorites. Not because of Crowley so much, but because I love the intro, the organ and the synthesizer. Very cool. So I thought, I better learn a little bit more. So I decided to read a biography called The Great Beast, The Life and Magic of Aleister Crowley by John Symonds. Now, there are a number of biographies of Aleister Crowley, but this one is special because John Symonds was his literary executor, and he actually met the man in his later years. And as far as I can tell, the book is out of print, unfortunately, but I was able to find a copy on the website archive.org of the ebook. I thought I knew a fair bit about Crowley, but it turns out that his life was a lot more complicated than I thought. He had a surprising amount of influence on popular culture. What, however, made him so notorious? I mean, there's been a lot of people who have founded cults and said outrageous things about the devil and so on. It's not an easy question to answer in Crowley's case, but his life is a lot about British society at the time and also about the world as a whole. He was born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875 in the English county of Warwickshire. His parents were Christian fundamentalists who were so strict they didn't even celebrate Christmas. Oh, that's a pagan holiday. No, it's evil. They had plenty of money from the family's investments in breweries, so I guess they were okay with using all that good alcohol money. Crowley was always a rebel, and I can relate to that, but I can't so much relate to much else about him. His domineering father died young of cancer, so the boy no longer had to travel around England preaching to people. And he also hated his mother. He really regarded her as some kind of a wicked witch. His mother didn't think much of it either. She referred to him as the beast, and that was very prophetic. His mother sent him away to boarding school, and he didn't do well there. He was always getting expelled for breaking the rules. He'd have to go to another one. And he was doing things like smoking and visiting prostitutes. Yeah, because it was all boys, so there was not exactly any girls there to get in trouble with. You had to go to a professional. Nonetheless, he still did get into the exclusive Trinity College at Cambridge. I guess your reputation didn't so much matter when you had money. He also was into rich man hobbies like mountain climbing. That's interesting. That I didn't know. He conquered several Alps in his youth between leaving regular school and going into Cambridge, and was climbing some of the Himalayas, including K2, the second highest mountain in the world, after college. And yet the man never really had an actual job. Okay, John Symonds' book gets into all of this. It jumps around a bit chronologically, so I occasionally got a little bit confused about what was happening when, but it doesn't pull any punches about the unsavory aspects of Crowley's life, and there were a lot of those. It was at Cambridge, 1895 to 98, when he attended, that he adopted the name Aleister. He really didn't like Edward Alexander, and he developed an interest in philosophy and the arts. It was also when he had his first same-sex experience. Or as they said at the time, the love that dare not speak its name. Shortly after that, he became interested in the occult and the ritual use of psychoactive drugs in magical ceremonies. Crowley was always seeking something, always finding new ways to rebel against conformity and conventional morality. He was involved with several esoteric societies, beginning with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And there was a lot of interest in spiritualism and stuff at the time, so a lot of relatively famous people were in that at the time. Now, this group had its origins in Freemasonry, alchemy, and Rosicrucianism, which I guess had something to do with a German guy named Rosenkreuz. Crowley also developed some ideas about what he called sex magic, spelled with a K, which involved group activities for magical purposes. What exactly they were trying to accomplish, besides the debauchery of the rites themselves, I've never quite been clear about. Crowley claimed he didn't do these things for the fun of it, that it was serious magic, and they called these ceremonies workings. And the book has loose descriptions of, like, 14 or 15 or more of them, and some of them were in England, some were in Paris. And you'd think in those stodgy days that they would have gotten themselves arrested, but somehow they didn't. So it was all serious, not for fun. Oh yeah, we believe you, Aleister. Now, contrary to popular misconception, Crowley was not actually a Satanist, though he did sign his letters Beast 666. He thought that was pretty cool. He was more of a pagan, claiming he worshipped the Egyptian god Horus, and he was going to usher in the new age of Horus. And he also incorporated some Hindu and Buddhist teachings into his new religion of Thelema, which came about later. Not that these religions would have really approved of what he was doing, I don't think. All this excess, all this hedonism, especially not Buddhism, they're not about that. Now, besides the staggering number of sex partners, both male and female, and of both white and black, he was progressive in that way. There was also his drug habits. Early on, he started with the ritual use of peyote, which Native American shamans do use to have mystical visions. So that's kind of understandable. And it's not unusual in mystical practice. And the book describes some of his visions that he had to great detail, and they're very silly, to be frank. But the man's downfall was, as Ozzy's song says in its lyrics, the white horse. Somehow, Crowley managed to live into his 70s while consuming prodigious amounts of cocaine and heroin. Now, Crowley, he rubbed shoulders with a lot of celebrities at the time. He was not an outcast for his activities, and I guess that kind of makes sense considering how many of our current famous people, get involved in things like that. The poet W.B. Yeats was a fellow member of the Golden Dawn, and many of you probably know him. He was a great poet, very accomplished. Though Crowley and Yeats were not on good terms, there was a lot of reasons that they couldn't stand each other. He also personally knew the writers W. Somerset Maugham and Victor Newberg, other people you may have heard of. He knew and admired the sculptors Augustus John and Rodin. The Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Walter Duranty was also one of his associates, participating in some of Crowley's interesting rituals. And he later married one of Crowley's discarded mistresses. There were numerous other actors, writers, and leaders of occult societies who were all famous, who all knew Crowley. Some admired him, some hated him. But a lot of those would be forgotten today, so I'm not going to get into them. Though Crowley was not officially a Satanist, he supposedly helped inspire Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satan. Also, sci-fi writer L. Ron Hubbard, founder of Scientology, was a member of Crowley's Thelema cult. Though some of these celebrities saw the sickness in Crowley's behavior and later denounced him, such as silent film star Betty May, who said he was evil, which gave rise to the phrase that he was the most wicked man in the world, a surprising number of them seemed to view him as kind of a harmless eccentric. What amazed me about Crowley was he seemed to live a charmed existence. All the bad decisions and the risky behavior, somehow he survived it all for quite some time to live to what was a reasonable lifespan. Now, gay sex was illegal at the time, but he was never prosecuted for it, as was Oscar Wilde, for example, in that famous case. He contracted syphilis at an early age and was treated with mercury, which was what they usually did at the time. And so somehow it didn't kill him. He started a blasphemous anti-Christian religion. Again, I was mentioning Thelema, and wrote its scriptures, including the Book of the Law, or Liber Legis. And its motto was, "Do what you wilt is the whole of the law." In other words, kind of do your own thing, kind of like the 60s. He ran his own religious commune based on Thelema in the village of Cefalu, Sicily. And yet he had no trouble with the law there, as nefarious as his hangers-on were, until Mussolini came into power in 1923, upon which they just booted him out. They didn't arrest him, they just said, "Get out." His erotic poems that he was always writing, they routinely got confiscated every time he returned to Britain. Yet they didn't send him to jail. I guess, he was rich. He was still living on his inheritance. So he was kind of able to buy all these different places. I mean, he owned a place in Scotland on the shores of Loch Ness, and he also had this place in Italy. He spent World War I, or most of it, in America, literally in the pay of the Germans for the first few years. And though he was accused of treason for spouting German propaganda, he was never prosecuted. I mean, he had like friends high in the government, or people who knew him or knew his family, and they said, "No, leave this guy alone. He's harmless." His reputation was pretty terrible, and his celebrities and literary types, as I said, they sought him out. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity. I mean, people do kind of wonder about these things. And he never ran out of sycophantic followers. Even after his inheritance ran out and he was living from a hand-to-mouth existence, there were always women who were willing to be his lovers. He had a particular title he would give to his primary girlfriend at the time, the Scarlet Woman. I kind of find that funny. And he did marry a few times, at least twice. I forget. It was a very complicated social life that he had. These women would stick with him even though some of them really hated his polyamorous lifestyle. They got really jealous. Some people might say that this proved that he was in league with Satan, because how did he have such a bizarre, morbid influence over people? How did he keep miraculously skirting trouble? Then again, if he really was getting help from Old Scratch, why did the fellow let him run out of money and have such a tough time of it? This was an era when we had notorious dictators like Stalin and Hitler and Mao and all these guys, Mussolini coming to power. That was one of Crowley's dreams. He thought he could become a great dictator and remold society. Of course, it was always kind of a joke. It never happened. And he also wanted to be the great prophet of the world, leading the people into a new age of Thelema and the god Horus. Though the Simons book, which was written in 1973, barely touches on it, later biographers such as Richard Spence and Tobias Churton theorized that he was actually working for British intelligence, even when he was writing German propaganda in America. And if so, he was probably what the Soviets would call a useful idiot, because he definitely wasn't really a patriot. I mean, he was very mercenary. He was willing to, go with whoever would pay him and allow him to gain power and influence. He wrote to the Soviets saying, "Yeah, I want to promote Bolshevism," and then he wrote to the British government saying, I want to spy on the Russians," that sort of thing. So again, why did they call him the wickedest man in the world? Well, that's what the actress Betty May called him, and that was understandable because her husband, who was a famous painter named Raoul something, slips my mind at the moment, He was a devoted follower of Crowley's, and he got sick while he was staying at Chefalu. He got sick and died because Crowley wasn't exactly very proactive with looking after the health of his friends. Betty May was understandably upset, and she found his sexual proclivities to be disgusting. Speaking of that, though, his affairs did seem to be primarily consensual, though he was quite emotionally abusive, and he drove at least two of his wives to drink and madness. His first wife, definitely, his first wife, Rose, she ended her life in an asylum. So while he was pretty wicked, I don't think he could really hold a candle to somebody like Stalin or Hitler, as I was saying. And also, some of our later mad prophets, like Charlie Manson, he didn't at least exhort his followers to murder anyone. So that at least you got to hand it. He fathered several children. That is, Crowley did. I think four. I kind of lost track. He fathered several children, and he was a terrible father. Not that he was abusive, he was just very neglectful. And some of the mothers weren't very good either, and he didn't seem to care about that. I mean, because he was heavy into drugs, and some of the mothers were. There was one called Leah, who was his scarlet woman for quite some time, and that was the mother of one of his children. Yeah, they weren't the best mothers, and some of the kids would get sick and die because they'd end up calling the doctor at the last minute. Oh my God, the kid's sick. What do we do? So, you can't really say much good about that. It's terrible. It's very, very, very sad. It's also interesting that his religion essentially preached anarchy. Do what thou wilt. Okay. But what about the consequences? And in fact, it's interesting that the people in his cult, in his commune in Sicily, they all had to do his bidding. He told them what to do and where to go, and they had to have a rite. They had to sing a rite to the rising sun in the morning and one at night, and they had to keep a magical diary, and there was all these things that they had to do because Crowley says so. The only people who were totally free were the children, and that was not good either because they ran around like wild beasts, chain smoking at the age of 6 and 7. I mean, that was ludicrous. In another source, The Myth of Disenchantment, the author claims that by do what thou willst, Crowley actually meant find your true purpose, which I guess sort of makes sense. Some of what he did was certainly get him arrested nowadays, besides being neglectful to his children. He'd ask a strange woman if she wanted a serpent's kiss. Now, because he was famous, they might say yes, or they might just sit there dumbfounded, trying to figure out what he meant. And without missing a beat, he would bite them. Seriously, he would bite them with his teeth that had been sharpened. He would bite them hard enough to draw blood. It's assault. I mean, really. And who would want to share bodily fluids with Crowley? I mean, imagine. Not a good thing. To accomplish all that he did in his interesting and crazy life, climbing mountains, writing books, doing paintings, and actually excelling at the game of chess, Crowley must have had a pretty high intelligence. I mean, seriously. And to do all of his PR machine that kind of kept him going, kept him in the news, kept all these dumb people sending him money for no good reason. It's just astounding. In the Wikipedia article, they note that modern critics have called him a misogynist, which I laughed out loud when I heard that because he treated everybody badly, not just women, including arguably himself, all the drugs he was doing. Yes, he was intentionally cruel to his scarlet women, and he was totally lacking in empathy and would use his friends and lovers until he tired of them and then abandon them, forget them completely. Oh, what was that? Oh, was I married to this gal? Gee, I left her, I abandoned her, and I married somebody else. I didn't even bother to get a divorce. uh, and so some of those people he abandoned grew sick and died, partly because they'd adopted his bad habits. Other times, he would file lawsuits against people, sometimes people he himself had wronged. And though he was fined at times, he did lose a lot of those lawsuits, and he, lost money because of that. He didn't go to jail, though he certainly deserved it in a lot of cases. Yet the public just had this continuing fascination with him. As reviled as he was, here was this rebel who was allowed to break the rules and get away with it. And at least he wasn't Charles Manson. That's all I can say. It sort of goes with this time of great change in Britain and the rest of the Western world. Because Crowley could have never done what he did 100 years before. No way. No way. He would have been put in jail, perhaps even executed. Who knows? I mean, we think of the early 20th century as a time of strict morals, but it wasn't entirely that way. As you might expect, Crowley's notorious story provided an inspiration for numerous writers in fiction. This included Crowley himself. Not surprisingly, given how narcissistic he was, and his own novel, Moonchild, included characters based upon himself, not surprisingly, and other prominent figures in the Golden Dawn organization. He worked on this story for quite some time. Critics didn't really think much of his writings. Of course, there was a lot of other writers. Probably the best known was W. Somerset Maugham, who was actually a associate of his, and he wrote a book called The Magician. And there was a sorcerer called Oliver Haddo, who was very closely based on Crowley, they say. Now, there's a few other examples from that time, and it's people that I had really never heard of, but several, quite a few are mentioned, like The Dancing Floor, 1926 by John Buchan, The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, also 1926 by Dion Fortune, and then there was a series called A Dance to the Music of Time, 1951 through 1975, quite a few books by Anthony Powell, and there were all these evil sorcerer characters. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means. In the 1960s, 20 years after his death, Crowley again became a cult figure, probably because of the prominence of sex and drugs in his religion. Beatles put him on the crowd scene on the Sgt. Pepper's album, and Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page bought Crowley's old estate by Loch Ness, and they actually recorded part of an album up there, and they wrote his motto, "Do what thou wilt," in one of their album covers. Now, several other rock stars were supposedly inspired by him, but of course there was a 1980 song by Ozzy Osbourne, though it's not exactly praising Crowley. Now, of course, I have to say, Crowley appears in Steampunk. There was the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a series of graphic novels by Alan Moore. Great series. 1999 through 2019, where he appears as a black magician, of course. And The Bloody Red Baron, a novel from 1995 by Kim Newman, which is part of the Anno Dracula series, which I read the first book and reviewed it, and it is really awesome. It is something you need to check out. So that is my review of the life of Aleister Crowley, particularly The Great Beast by John Simons. It is amazing how he survived for so long, 72 years, how he's continued to fascinate the world with his bizarre life, even now, 80 years later. And so I thought, this being the festive Halloween season, that it was appropriate to celebrate a man who kind of defined a lot of those black occult ideas that we find interesting today. Please let me know what you think about it in the comments. Please like and subscribe. Please also check out my works on Amazon. And as I've mentioned before, I am writing a third book in the IOD series. I plan to get that one published next year sometime. But until then, check out the 2 IOD books that we already have on Amazon. Links are in the description. For now, this is Steampunk Desperado saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.